in November to present to us. But just a few days before that presentation, we had to cancel it because Sara was in a bicycle accident and sustained a concussion. So we're delighted to have been able to reschedule her for this evening. And we have with us the fully recovered Dr. Sara Curran. So please join me in warmly welcoming her to our program this evening. Sara.
Thank you, Karen. I'm so happy to be here this year, despite the long year we've had. It's wonderful to be with all of you. And thank you, Amy, for all of the logistical support. And I'm looking forward to sharing my presentation, and I'm looking forward to our conversation afterwards. It's really a delight to be engaged with the Olympia World Affairs Council. So I will share my screen. So I am delighted to be here. I am a demographer by training, which is a wonderful discipline, interdisciplinary discipline, because it's a field that allows you to think both in very theoretical ways and also in very practical ways. And I'm a big advocate for the field. And so I'm going to be sharing with you some statistics and some ways in which we think about population trends as demographers. And so we'll go through this as clearly as possible, but please don't hesitate to ask me later to go back and clarify one or any number of my slides. Many of you, I was born in the 60s, and that was the very tail end of the baby boom, and grew up in the worries about the population bomb and all of those concerns. And not that those concerns aren't still with us today, but we do have some ways in which we might want to nuance how we think about those particular forecasts from 40, 50 years ago. So my talk today will be about what do the forecasts look like? How should we be thinking about the components of demographic change, and what do those imply about the risks associated with poverty and development, aging, and environmental impacts and climate vulnerabilities. So in fact, I'm going to spend most of my time talking about demographic forecasts, and then lightly touching on a few ways in which we ought to think about, consider, contemplate some of how those patterns relate to other factors in the world and in societies. So first of all, let me, and I think that my screen here, this is out in the way. Amy, if there's anything blocking the screen, let me know. So let me share with you this first population projections to 2100. And first of all, let's start with the point that in 2015, the population of the world was 7.4 billion people. It's estimated that by 2050, our population will be 9.7 billion people, plus or minus 0.7 billion. And this line is showing to you that we're starting to bend the curve on the rate of growth. Now we're still growing, but we're growing at a slower rate once we hit, once we start to hit 2040. The darker blue line, or the blue lines on the outer edges, are if on average women had plus 0.5 children and a half of a child more, on average. The upper bound blue would determine the trajectory of our population. If on average, all women, on average had a half a child less, we would actually be bending down a lot further, a lot quicker in that lower blue bounded line. Oops, let's see, my slide isn't advancing. Here we go. So what does this look like? One of the things that we do as demographers is we often then want to look at distributions and differences and patterns around the world, across ages, et cetera. So first we're going to look across high income and low income countries, comparing the two sets. And we can see that in high income countries, the population rates of growth are really going to flatten out by 2040. The red line is the predicted median prediction of the population growth. Whereas in low income countries, we're going to continue to see population growth at a fairly steady clip. In fact, by 2050, low income country populations will be 1.4 billion. And for high income countries, it'll be 1.28 billion. And then middle income countries that comprise most of the world's population are, driving that larger world population curve that we saw earlier. So it looks very similar. And in fact, essentially, you'll see us flattening out again by 2040. So let me talk a little bit about the components of population change, because these components have a lot to do with how we think about how population trends relate to economic growth, poverty, aging, and climate and environmental sustainability. So, and I want to talk through this a bit. We can get into the details, but I think oftentimes we think about the larger rapid growth of the population, and we don't think about its component parts and how the component parts have implications for society and social organization. So those component parts are things that we call a larger issue that we call demographic transitions. I want to talk with you a bit about life expectancy and mortality and fertility and migration and age and sex distributions, and I'll show you lots of figures. And then we'll discuss these other societal implications. So first of all, the big idea in demography that's been there for a really long time is something called demographic transitions. And this describes how in stage 1 of early historic populations, for the most part, you have both very high birth rates and very high death rates, which control the size of the population. The death rates control the size of the population. Children die at a very early age, often, even though you may have a lot of children. And so that yields a population pyramid that we've typically called, this is a very early population pyramid in the bottom here, in the bottom of the graph. If you move to stage 2, what you see is rapid decline of mortality, or death rates are falling, but birth rates remain high. And consequently, you have a growing population, which is the yellow curve, growing of the yellow curve. And then in stage 3, you start to have birth rates falling. Death rates may slow down because they can only fall so far. And then and the base of your pyramid starts to get squeezed together, compressed. And by stage 4, you have low fertility, low death rates, and sort of a very narrow and tall pyramid. We haven't really seen this, but you may get to stage 5 where you have very low death rates, and then a country may decide to have very encouraging, incentivized pro-natalist policies to encourage more births among its population. So let's start with this idea of falling death rates and life expectancy. And here I want to talk through with you, life expectancy is a very good measure that accounts for mortality. It's sort of the it accounts for age-specific mortality, and it projects how long the average person will live during, and it's usually expressed in years. And let's take a look at the trends over the last couple of decades. Now here, what I want to do is share with you life expectancy of birth for females, which is the left panel, and life expectancy at birth for males, which is the right panel. And the colors here, blue is very low life expectancy, so very short lifespans. And as you move towards red, it's higher or longer life expectancy. And this particular two panels are showing 1970 to 1975. And I'm going to show you 5-year increments of life expectancy across the globe. So orienting yourself, the middle of the map is African continent. We've got the Latin America and South America and North America on the left, and then Asia and the Pacific on the right. And so we have very low life expectancies in Africa with the blue. And women have, as you can see in the US and North America, women have higher life expectancy than men do. So they're yellow color for the women and a little greener for the men. All right, that should orient you as we move through the slides here. So this is the 1980 to 1985 period. We see a lightening up, a little bit of lightening up. This is the 1990 to 1995 period. Here, women's life expectancy is improving, continues to improve relative to men's. Everybody's improving overall. This is 2010 to 2015. So when we're for Australia, Northern Europe, we're looking at the left panel, Northern Western Europe and the North American, as well as the Argentinian coast, we have women living 80 to 85 years on average. For men, those rates are only reached for those men in Australia and in the Nordic countries, so some Nordic countries. And then 2025 expectancies are even extending longer and improving for men as well, but women still are outpacing men. 2030, 2035, etc. Oops. So it's not until 2055 that you really start to see some significant improvement for men. What about total fertility? Now, one of the things that I want you to keep in mind here is, again, we're always talking about averages, and we usually, as demographers, we're always standardizing those averages by the age composition of the population. Total fertility rate is the number of children who would be born per woman if she were to pass through the entire childbearing years, according to the current schedule of age-specific fertility rates. The basic rule of thumb here is that replacement fertility equals 2. So if your total fertility rate equals 2, that means on average, women are having 2 children over the course of their childbearing years. So what does this look like? Now, what I want this intuitively, the color scheme is the same, but the red is very high fertility and the blue is very low fertility. So not surprisingly, many of you will know that fertility rates are very high in sub-Saharan Africa and also high in Central America. And this is true in 1970, 1975, and they were already quite low in the northern part of the hemisphere. And now we'll go through the same steps by decade. So 1980 to 85, bluer is lower fertility again. So we're seeing really quite dramatic drops in fertility as we hit 2000. In fact, parts of Russia are below replacement, 1.5 to 1.75. And as we move through the decades, as we forecast forward, we see we are below replacement by 2030 on most of Central North America and South America. And we're getting down towards 3 to 2 in Sub-Saharan Africa. So how do we think about where most of this change is happening in terms of rates of population change? Really, most of our change in population is happening already in Africa. The sharpest declines are happening in Africa compared to the rest of the country, rest of the world. This is the rate of population change. So it's still above 1 in Africa, but it's declining pretty quickly. And we have fairly low levels of, almost declining populations in Europe, below 0. Now, that's not to say that the concentration of most of our population growth is half of the world's population growth will be concentrated in only 9 countries. And those 9 countries include the United States, as well as India, Nigeria, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Pakistan, Ethiopia, Tanzania, Uganda, and Indonesia. And that's sort of in order of their relative importance. Well, let's just quickly take a look at population pyramids, just to give you a sense across different places and give you something to think about here. Now, I want 2 concepts that I want to share with you, which are often talked about. One is, and especially they're often talked about in places like Asia in the 1980s, and then nowadays in Africa. Where we talk about the demographic dividend. And this is where you have a lot of people in the working age populations relative to the elderly and relative to children. Demographic deficits, on the other hand, is another concern. And this is a concern that is growing, especially in those countries where you have, especially in countries like Europe or Japan, where you have very few people in the working age population and quite a few people in the elderly population. So in other words, not enough working age people to take care of the people in need. And these demographic dividends are expected to help a place grow because you've got so many working age people who don't need to take care of very many others. Whereas demographic deficits are predicted to stymie economic growth. So things to consider. So this is the world's population pyramid in 2017. And typically you see men and women split out. And the rows are ages. So these are the percentage of people in each age group by 5-year age groups. And this is sort of your very classic still growing population pyramid, what you were seeing maybe in stage 2, 3, stage 3 of the demographic transition. Now they do vary across place. So the United States in 1950 looked like this on the left panel. By 2017, it looked much more like a stage 4 population. And even more so by 2050. On the other hand, we have a country like China that had quite a steep pyramid in 1950. In 2017, it has what's called the demographic dividend, a lot of working age people, generating a lot of growth. And then by 2050, it's expected to have a demographic deficit of a lot of elderly people and not very many people supporting those elderly. This is also much more dramatically true in Japan, where you see in the 1950s this classic pyramid. By 2017, you're starting to see the working age bulge move up through and into the elderly group, and by 2015, it's quite pronounced. This is India. Obviously, it's moving a little differently than the rest of the earlier cases that we were just looking at. But it has its demographic dividend, really its demographic dividend by 2050. And then Nigeria. Nigeria is really going to outpace for a while. It's still pretty much in a stage 2 high fertility, low mortality kind of population pyramid. These points would be obvious also from the population pyramids, but just wanted to share with you the age distributions by percentages for each continent side by side. Just want to point out that for the orange bars are 0 to 14 years old. The blue bars are 15 to 24. This is your future. Your working age population that will move in the next 10 years. Your 25 to 59-year-olds are in green, and your 60 plus are in purple. So what we can see is that in Europe, Europe has the highest proportion of elderly folks in the world at this date. Africa has a much higher population of very young people, 0 to 14, 41%. And you can draw your own conclusions from the remainder of the slides here, the remainder of the bars. So the other phenomenon that affects population is migration. And I wanted to quickly share with you some images around a graph around migration patterns. Migration is actually my area of study, and I'm happy to talk to you more about it. But what this graph is showing to you is that the places that are a light tan, orange, darker burnt orange, those are places that are receiving migrants into their countries. And the blues are places that are losing people to migration away from their countries. And so Oceania, or mostly Australia, North America, and Europe are all this tan, orange, burnt color, and they're all receiving net receivers of migrants. And Latin America, Asia, and Africa are all net losers of immigrants. Relatively low rates of net migration, but still important to see this geographic distribution. Another component of migration is internal migration, and that has to do with the balance of people in rural and urban areas. And again, what we see over time is places are becoming increasingly urban, and this is the population in millions. So we see a crossover happening that happened essentially in 2005 between 2005 and 2010, when most of the world's population lived in cities. If you look across the world, you can see that most continents are predominantly urban. Latin America and the Caribbean, North America, Oceania, and Europe. The places that remain predominantly rural are Africa and for the most part. So what are the implications for development and poverty? And I'll wrap, this won't take very long. what I'd like to point out is, first of all, where are the working age people in the world? Where are the elderly? Where do we expect them to be? And who's going to be doing the work that needs to get done? It's important to recognize that half of working age people will added to the population will be in sub-Saharan Africa. And they will need 2 million jobs per month to keep up with their population growth. So this is that bump. This is really dramatic. This is very serious and something that needs attention. How do we catalyze that potential given the levels of education and access to technology in that part of the world? How do you generate endogenous growth potential? How do you avoid disaffection and discontent when you don't have enough economic growth? How do you stem the tides of migrants, for example, to Europe in that particular case? The other is, what are the implications of these patterns for aging? What's important here is that of the world's population between 2011 and 2100, there'll be estimated about 2 billion elderly. Half of them are going to be living in Asia, and half of the world's population will be elderly by 2050. Now, the social burden of aging, generally, aging populations have lower environmental impacts, but they have higher healthcare burdens. So the question is, who's going to be providing that care, who will pay for it, and how will wealth transfers be managed in these contexts, where you have very, very disparate differently disparate distributions of population. What are the environmental implications of these patterns? Well, I want to just quickly mention that affluence is one of the biggest factors in influencing how how much of an impact population has on the environment, and how do we, who has access to the consumption resources and money and resulting footprint is an important debate. One of those debates is, how do we lower the impact, what factors lower the impact on the environment most, and how do assessments of quality of life affect both the impact measure and the affluence measure? This is a very difficult and challenging question, and it's one that has challenged the IPCC community for over 2 decades. When we think about what are the implications of these patterns for climate change, I think it's important to keep in mind, where are climate vulnerabilities and where are the world's populations to begin with. One of the questions here, this map shows a map of extreme vulnerability to little vulnerability. The yellow is more yellow is less vulnerability. Orange and red is greater vulnerability. And as you can see, again, the places where the most people are the places where you're going to have the most vulnerability to climate change. And certainly this is something we know already, but I think it's well worth thinking about. What do we do about it? Especially when we're talking about places in Africa where you have a growing number of young people moving into the economy who will become even further potentially disaffected. So big questions for those associated with climate vulnerabilities is, how soon will we have climate refugees? What are the kinds of adaptive behaviors that might result at the community level? How easily are people displaced and moved as a result of climate change, et cetera. So this is what I wanted to say today. I talked with you about one thing is that our population is there. The population forecasts appear to be our growth is slowing. However, how it's slowing and where it's slowing is differentially distributed around the globe. And that has implications for which places have demographic dividends, which places have demographic deficits. And those raise a lot of questions about economic development and poverty, the social burden of aging, and how we think about environmental impacts and climate vulnerabilities. And that's all I had to say today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sarah. This is pretty interesting, and we do have a couple of questions in the chat room. Before I go there, I wanted to start off the question and answer period by asking you about the growing literature that seems to be appearing on declining fertility rates. Those population pyramids you showed us, those
Yes.
assume the same rate of fertility and not this declining fertility that seems to have caught people's attention?
Yeah, so the pyramids are like a snapshot in time of the distribution of people at that particular time. Whereas so that's just the proportion of a pyramid is just going to tell you how many people are in each age group. It's not going to tell you something about the fertility rate per se. The fertility rate looks at the number of children born to women over their life course, and then adjusts that to predict, the rate of change of fertility, or the possibility of rate of change. So the pyramids are more of a snapshot and give you less insight on the future population. So if we know that women are having on average 2 children, we pretty much can predict that the pyramid is going to start to look very much like a cylinder, without a base, without a big pyramidal base. If you've got total fertility rates of 3, 4, or 4, you will have a quite obvious pyramid-like shape, because you're having more than the 2, the average 2. You're having 3, 4 children. That's going to grow your base relative to the adults in the population. Does that answer your question, Curran?
Yes, I think so. And there's actually a couple of related questions in the chat room, so I'll move there. Our first question from Nina Carter is, please explain why USA population growth is as high as India and Africa. Is it in-migration rather than births, or?
I'm trying to think about which line you might have been looking, which population growths you were looking at in my images. But the US population, so the total fertility rate for the United States has been above 2 for quite a long time, which means that we actually are slightly above replacement fertility. In other words, we're still a growing population. Once you get below 2, that's when your population is shrinking. And just this year, the United States fell below 2. And so this is related to the second part of your question, which is when we have migrants coming into the United States, many of our migrants are younger. Many of our migrants come in and they have children, and they tend to have more children. But on average, they tend to be younger and be in childbearing ages. And they are replenishing our population in such a way that it keeps it growing. So that is why we continue to grow, as opposed to European countries where that kind of migration hasn't been the case, despite the fact that they have very strong pro-natalist policies and lots of family leave and all of those things that might be assumed to encourage fertility and haven't. So I don't hope that answers that question. And Nina, I'm happy to answer further if you want to follow up.
Yeah. Nina says that answers her question. Thank you.
So our next question is, what impact has the pandemic had upon these statistics?
Yeah, well, the biggest impact has been in the United States, and I'm sure many of the people in the audience have seen the statistics, but we have on average this year alone lost we have lost I think almost 2 years of life expectancy on average as a result of the pandemic in our country alone. And that is really quite startling. And the thing to recognize is that, in fact, those losses have been greatest for African American and Hispanic Latino communities because they have experienced deaths at very younger ages, at the working age, those frontline workers who are most exposed to the pandemic. And because those younger aged people have died, that really cuts your life expectancy down quite a lot, because all of a sudden they don't have those years of life that they would have lived anyway. Whereas among whites, that has not been the case, since most of the burden of the mortality has happened at much older ages. So you don't have the same sort of impact on life expectancy. I think it's around 1 for loss of 1 year for whites. So this is one of those examples of just how clearly differentiating the pandemic has been on different populations in the US.
Yes. And so our next question is, you mentioned the 1960s and 70s concerns about population growth. How should we think about the social implications of those eras' call for zero or negative population growth?
Yeah, I think it's complicated, and it's just only gotten more complicated. I'm not a zero population growth person. I think it has those also have very tough implications for places. So when you have countries like Northern European countries that really are shrinking, how do they manage how they will care for their elderly? How will they manage the labor force that they need to keep their economy growing? How do we think about economic growth? I think it requires a whole rethinking about the logic of economic and social organization. I don't have an answer. I'd love to hear what you all think. I think the other aspect of this, so I don't think that the population bomb scares were nuanced enough back then. What it did do, though, and I think this is really important, is that it was also associated with efforts to encourage economic development, efforts to encourage education for women, efforts to, it had a lot of ancillary positive spillover effects for social life that resulted because of that effort to control fertility. That's also had negative effects because there have been some people who have felt that those efforts to control fertility have been focused more on people who are not Western and who are Black or brown or people of color, as opposed to thinking about quality of life and the needs of all people. So I think it has had fraught ethical implications. So I don't have an easy answer for you.
Well, thanks. Here's another question. How accurate are the United Nations estimates of future fertility and mortality, given the likely effects on our world of climate change?
Yeah, so we've just actually the University of Washington, and I have nothing to do with it, but at the University of Washington, we have some of the leading experts who are informing the UN estimations. And those made a relatively large improvement in the estimation techniques in 2010 in particular. And our estimates have gotten better and better. We're constantly updating them with sample surveys and that inform and provide new data. So I think that now what you're asking though is a question about simulation. How do we simulate the impact of climate change? And this is one thing that I is very difficult to assess. Um, Probably there's not a lot of clarity around what will happen to fertility. It could be that nutrition will decline dramatically, and nutrition is associated with fertility. But of course, it's also fertility has to do with access to contraception and family planning, not just nutrition. And so you know, will climate change disrupt healthcare provision? Will climate change upend all of the services that might be available to people that would prevent them from getting access to family planning or other services or economic growth? The other piece of it is climate change is likely to impact how we think about disease and disease spreads and virus spreads. And I think this is, again, maybe this year is something that will tell us something about that as well. So I don't have good answers for you, and neither do the modelers.
And a very related question, to what extent is rapid, unbridled climate change the main driver of population decrease within the next 30 to 50 years, given its effects on agriculture, water availability, and other resources?
Yeah, I I think that the climate change that we will, I think that we're going to, this is really, these are questions about the climate change that you're talking about associated with agricultural change are really slow onset changes. We may hit a tipping point where all of a sudden everything changes as a result. And then we have some major catastrophes, but these changes are relatively slow, and it seems that people are adapting, even in places like where I've done a lot of field work in Thailand. Rice varieties are having to be developed to adapt to changes in temperature, which affects flowering and affects the rice yields. And farmers are adapting and developing new breeds as they're happening, as well as research and R&D investments are happening there. So I'm not sure that those slow onset climate change effects will have that much to do with population change. I think what will have an effect are these major tipping points, whether those are having to do with catastrophic weather events, whether those have to do with really very different changes in ocean circulation and fisheries and disrupting fisheries. And those are all going to happen in a fairly quick, I think, way. And that will be a disaster. So it'll be more related to disasters than slow onset.
And I think this question is very related. How will energy supplies affect these statistics? For instance, if oil supply declines sharply, oil has made it possible for plentiful food, both energy-wise and fertilizer-wise. What will be the role of new energy sources, and what will they be? More nuclear?
Oh, well, I know Bill Gates has a lot of ideas about this, and and he is in our backyard, and he would probably say it is possible. And I know that the Gates Foundation is working on a lot of technical solutions. I think a lot of it's going to have to do, I mean, fossil fuel consumption has to decline. And if we're going to avoid getting to, you know, if we're going to avoid disaster. So maybe I think distributed energy, you know, distributed grids, localizing food production, thinking about new ways to organize economic and social relationships is probably going to be the long-term solution. And whatever we can do to localize appropriate technology, the better, whether that's energy, whether that's food production, whether that's even governance and communication. Large scale, highly integrated, centralized systems are really going to be increasingly vulnerable to any kind of disasters, and we have to think differently about our systems of survival.
And do you see Latin immigration to the US as a problem or actually something we need?
I think we need immigrants. I think that one of the problems that we have today, this week, the crisis this week, or the crisis in 2019, is a function of other factors. In some ways, we sort of created them. A lot of the immigrant challenges have been created because of civil wars, violence in places of origin, sort of ways in which we do economic development in the rest of the world, or we maybe could do it better, or it could be done better. Whether and how we support various kinds of governments has a lot to do with how vulnerable and how willing people are to take the risk to come here. We have benefited from migrants for a very long time, and we have an aging population, and we will need immigrant know-how and innovation and hard work. So we have to come up with some way to manage it. And I think that it is feasible for us to do it. We're just not doing a very good job right now.
So another question, don't we need to reimagine what economic growth is? If we continue to use the same standards for that in the West and the rest of the world for that matter, then we continue on the same path of climate crisis due to our habits. Can we talk about what any of those reimaginings might look like?
Yeah, I think that would be great. I would love to talk about those reimaginings and hear what all of you have to say about that. That is partly what I was suggesting with my question, my last few slides. I think we really have to rethink how we organize what we mean by quality of life, how we ensure and create security for people to have a quality of life that that is good enough for all of us. And I do think we have to reimagine it. I don't have any answers for you. Of all places, I think Seattle, or no, I shouldn't say Seattle, Olympia, Seattle, the Pacific Northwest might have some good ideas. And there are probably some really great creative ideas in sub-Saharan Africa too, amongst these young people. I think that one thing I should say that I've experienced over and over again is that most people really love their home place. They don't really want to leave their home place. Most people don't want to make those long journeys to places unknown, per se. They really want to create a place for themselves in their land and in the place of their kin and the like. And I'm not saying that we're parochial and not interested in the rest of the world, but my experience in much of Asia and in Latin America is that is the case. And the problem is we haven't really allowed them to thrive in a way that would be in their, have them realize have the most realization of their humanity.
And another question, what effect will automation have, do you think, on demographic deficits?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I know Japan is working, doing a lot of work in this area where they're developing robots and robotic efforts to care, artificial intelligence to care for the elderly, as opposed because they don't have enough people to take care of the elderly. It's an interesting question. I don't know, but I understand the motive for the question.
What are demographers' current thoughts about the success, failure, implications of China's one-child policy?
Yeah, that is a big debate. The I think most many non-Chinese scholars have have so have made the case that have argued that it was unethical it was an unethical policy in the way it was implemented. There are some other scholars who will say that the one-child policy had the effect of saving lives because those that were able to live and survive had enough food and they were able to grow and everything. The many Chinese scholars in China and in the U.S. also argue that it was absolutely essential for China to do this. Otherwise, they would have had terrible famines, terrible mortality rates. They are now facing the issue of marriage, a loss, a real, because of the way the one-child policy has been implemented, they have a shortage of females in their population, so they have a marriage market drought. And they also have a very aging population, rapidly aging population, as I showed you. So the consequence of the one-child policy, perhaps some people might have said that they might have stopped the one-child policy a little sooner than they did, instead of waiting. They might have stopped it, 5 or 10 years earlier than they did.
And so I think this is meant slightly tongue-in-cheek, but actually, so is the bottom line that the United States, Europe, and Japan are going to have to import workers from Nigeria?
They already are. So, yeah, there's a very strong networks between Africa and China right now, and there are two reasons for that. Part of it is China is taking advantage of opportunities for land and development in Africa and access to some resources there. And then Africans are coming to China to do labor, major kinds of labor in China in various work enclaves. So I think it's already happening. It'll be an interesting experiment. There are other places where you see it, and I'm not so sure it has been that successful, like the Dutch. The Dutch have brought, from their various colonial ex-colonies, have brought people to the Netherlands to fulfill major parts of their labor force needs. But there have also been problems there around race and racial tensions that have been tough to overcome. That's also true in China. So these are hard kinds of. I think it's a solution. It also has to be done with a great deal of thoughtfulness around integration and incorporation that recognizes everybody's humanity. I noticed that there was a question here. I might spin back to Janine said, agreed about local agriculture, but that is not all at all Gatesville. Oh, I'm not sure what you mean, Janine, but I wasn't implying that Gates was suggesting a large scale systems. I don't know what you mean here, Janine.
I was agreeing with you. I was agreeing.
Oh, okay.
You were saying that you were focusing, that you thought that decentralized
Yes.
systems would be needed in the future. But you had also mentioned Bill Gates working on or the Gates Foundation working on this a lot. And I was just saying, that is not my understanding of what Gates is
No,
on.
no, he's not.
I was agreeing with you, actually.
Yeah, you're right. No, he has big ideas for big technological fixes. I just want to get things localized and get creativity at the local level.
And so, Sarah, there was also a comment from Senator Fraser a couple of years ago. She was visiting with a couple of Japanese friends in Japan who said that the demographic deficit there was having really big negative implications for real estate. Does that make sense to you?
Yes, I guess. I mean, I'm just going to guess that it's because the demand. I mean, when you have a rapidly aging population, their demand for consumption, for resources, for I mean, they're just not buying. They're not really contributing a lot to economic growth in the same way as some, cohorts of people in the working age or who are having children or building their families. That's a very different kind of demand on real estate or on consumption that can drive an economy. So when you have an aging population, that can really undercut sort of the endogenous, what we call endogenous engine of growth, and that can be very difficult. Yeah, and lots of vacancies in apartments. So they, anticipating growth, you invest in property, you build a lot of, high density properties, and all of a sudden there aren't that many people there to fill those high density properties. And that's an issue. Yeah.
Got it. Okay.
So here's a good big question for you. Do you think there's a limit to what is a sustainable population on Earth?
Yeah. Well, so it's not the number, it's it's how we organize how much we are consuming and how we decide how much we're going to use to generate a quality of life that sustains us. That's the issue. I mean, the United States per capita consumes far more, individuals consume far more than people in Africa. So adding one more American is far more burdensome on the environment and sustainability than adding an African, I'm sorry to say. So, and I think it's a question of how are we going to scale back, create a reasonable quality of life, and make sure that everybody can do that sustainably. And I don't have an answer on a number, but I am actually, I think most people who want contraception, in fact, most people want to have some way of controlling fertility, if they can see a future where they don't need to have a lot of children to care for them, and they see possibilities of a quality of life with one or two children in their midst. And that, if that happens, and because if you remember my curves, the blue lines that were on either side of the curves, the lower blue line, it wouldn't take much to kind of bend that curve way down and drop our population, our population size, if people decided to have on average a half a child less. So it's not really that much more for us to shrink our population. And then the question is, you know, how much per person is it going to take to have a high quality of life for all of us?
And then
Or-
finally, yes.
Yes.
And then finally, could you discuss the apparent need for education and economic development in Africa? What's happening with that today and what is planned for the future? What is the role of the current developed world in that effort?
That's a good question. We really lost 4 years on that front. In the last 4 years, we withdrew from that investment. So during the George W. Bush era, there was a recognition of the value of the demographic dividend in Africa and the importance of investment in Africa, and that continued through the Obama administration. And there was good progress made there. Much of that was withdrawn and declined investments through the last 4 years of the Trump administration. I don't know whether we're ready or have, I don't know what the new administration's plans are, but I know that UNESCO and the World Bank are actively working to keep these education programs going, and to because what I talked about in the very beginning of my talk, half of the world's population is going to be between now and 2050, half of the world's population is going to be coming from Africa. So we have to invest in Africa. We have to invest in their future. And that it's just, that's really important to appreciate. And I know that the bank and the UN recognize that concern.
Amy, do you see any more questions in the chat room?
No, I think we've come to the end of our questions for tonight.
Great. Yeah, that was a lot of questions. That was very interesting, Sarah. Thank you so much. I'm so glad we were able to finally bring you back, and glad to see you're all repaired from your.
Thank you. I really appreciated it and enjoyed the questions and the conversation, and happy to come back another time, and love to see you in person.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And for those of you who regularly join us, please join us again next month on Thursday, April 15th for our final program of this program year before we go on our summer hiatus and don't start up again until September. Our speaker is Benjamin Meacham, and his topic will be a really cheerful one: genocide. So I hope you'll join us. And once again, Sarah, I hope you can hear all the applause coming across from you. We appreciate you joining us this evening. This was wonderful. Thank you very much.
Bye.
Good night. Good night to everybody.
Thanks, Sarah.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Bye.